Hello and welcome to the first video in the Research Ethics for Coursework at Haskayne School of Business series. This video will discuss research methods and ethics, and our goal here is to understand at a high level what kind of research methods you might be using and how that relates to research ethics. My name is Alice DeConing and I work with the entrepreneurship and strategy areas at the Haskayne School of Business, and in both these areas we tend to use a lot of research methods. The first step is to understand the different sources and different methodologies that we, or different types of data that we have when we're doing research for coursework. So we can talk about secondary sources and primary sources. Secondary sources are sources that where the data has been gathered by someone else for a totally different process or purpose than what your research project is about, and yet you're able to use that data. So examples might be census data that StatsCan collects and that you can use for your work. Primary sources is data that is collected directly by you or your team for a specific project and for a specific purpose, and that can include talking to individual people, it can be focus groups, surveys, etc. And within that we have quantitative data and qualitative data. So we're including both the kind of data that you would get out of a survey where you would be able to count how many people and what preferences people have for one thing or another. And then qualitative data, which could be stories, it could be descriptions, it could be discussions, and that would be fall under qualitative data. From a research ethics point of view, the key issue here is it a primary source? Because when we talk about primary sources, we're talking about collecting data through observation or through talking to people in most cases. Of course, there are some types of research that don't involve talking to people, but that's not typical in business research. So what is research ethics? Fundamentally, it's a process and a standard for respecting people in the context of research. So we're concerned here for ethical issues, legal issues, social issues, and political issues. So we need to be aware that there's much more to it than just lying to people. Sometimes our conversations can have broader implications. And the objectives of research ethics is simply to protect human participants, to ensure that the research and the project protects the interests of the individuals and groups that are involved in the research, and to look at the research and the project activity for ethical soundness. So something that comes up a lot in business research that is really important to be aware of is that some people think it's okay to lie when you're calling someone up for information and to say that you're a potential customer or something like that. And under this standard, we would say that it's not, because lying to the potential competitor or to another person is not protecting their interests. So that's just an example of where this research ethics type questions come in, and it fundamentally is that we're looking at our information sources as people first and foremost. So the kind of projects, course-based projects that might be included in this in the issue of research ethics could be conducting interviews, distributing questionnaires and surveys to the public, and gathering and analyzing data from human participants. And collecting data from human participants can be done as an individual student, as a small group, or as a single class project where everyone is engaged in that. And because of the potential risk to the participants, we have a requirement that protocols and consent processes should be followed. And so several forms may be required before the research begins. And so the exact kinds of forms depends on the type of research, and what exactly you should do is something should be discussed with your faculty member. Our goal is to provide resources to everyone so that it would be as easy as possible for us to do research in an ethical manner. Now, there has been a development over the last 20 to 30 years where Indigenous communities have said that the standards that we have for research ethics that focus on individuals is really not adequate to deal with the kinds of experiences that Indigenous communities have experienced. And so they have developed research ethics that focus more on communities and groups. And what's interesting about this is that it is in fact also the principles and the logic that we should be using for all types of groups, especially vulnerable groups. And an example that's often given is that if we're doing research with homeless people, do we treat them as individuals or do we treat them as a group and respect their rights and their dignity as a group? So that's something to think about. Specifically under Indigenous research ethics standards, we have four key elements under the OCAP standards. And I should say that there are other standards. This one is the most widely known, but there are other people who have developed similar ideas in other details of research ethics principles. And I encourage you to look into that if you're interested. So the first principle here is that ownership of the information. And the idea here is that an individual doesn't own the information. The community or the group owns the information collectively. So if you are talking about your personal information, yes, you own that. But if you're part of a community, you don't own that community information. The second principle is control. And here the assertion is that the First Nations and their communities and their representative bodies have the rights. And they should be able to control from start to finish all aspects of research and information processes that impact them. And so this means that somebody can't just come in, helicopter in, and then collect a bit of data and leave. The idea is that the First Nations should be involved from the very beginning of a project to the very end. And a lot of this principles comes out of medical and other types of research that was done in Indigenous communities, where people would come in, take samples, and then actually never get back to the communities to talk about the research and what they learned and how that might be interesting for the people that participated. So this is a way for the First Nations and their communities to ensure that they are engaged in the research project and that they maintain control over that process. The next principle is that First Nations should have access to all the information and data about themselves regardless of where it's held. So imagine doing a research project and you've collected, let's say, a lot of business case data about businesses that are in an Indigenous community or involved in Indigenous people, and that is now being held at the university. The issue here is that it should be clear where that information is held, how to access it, and possibly even to transfer the location of the data to the communities themselves. And this is the fourth principle, the principle of possession. So physical control of the data being managed by the Indigenous communities themselves. And here is the principle here is that if you don't have it, it's hard to assert ownership of this information. I could go into a whole lot more details about this, but the principle is always the same here. We respect the human participants that are touched by our research. We know that in business research, it's far less likely that we would discuss very difficult subjects and subjects that have enormous risk to the individuals involved in the research. That's just, we don't do psychology, we don't do medical research. But still, it's very important for us to respect that people could have effects from sharing data with us, and we need to make sure that we have the mechanisms in place for them to consent to being part of the research, for them to consent in us using the research and perhaps publishing it, and respecting the communities that people are part of. So that's the end of this particular this first video, and I will now go on to the next video, which will talk about informed consent.